And we are live. I wanted to welcome everybody to the iComply Fireside Chat on DAOs Networks of Trust. I am Andrew Weiner, the head of partnerships here at iComply, responsible for managing about 150 partnerships across the world with corporate, professional, legal service providers, financial institutions, payment processors, and more. I'm joined today by an all-star cast of panelists. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves one at a time here, starting with Jonathan on my right.
Yes, thank you. Attorney Jonathan Dunsmore Law, Buffalo, New York. We work with securities-related, corporate-related clients, and now have delved deep into the blockchain space since probably about 2016. Trying to keep people out of trouble, trying to help regulators understand what this fun stuff is as the technology progresses way faster than regulations. So here to clear up any questions that anyone may have and try to make this space a more regulatory compliant and friendly space for entrepreneurs.
Great, and I'm also an attorney as well. My name is Andrew Bull. I'm the founding partner of Bull Blockchain Law. We're a boutique law firm based out of Philadelphia, and we handle representation of clients in all different aspects of the space. I myself started on the technology side. I ran an investment fund in digital assets as well as a cryptocurrency mining company. And while I was in law school, I wrote about the regulation or lack thereof of digital assets and cryptocurrencies in the United States. And so today, just running basically the law firm and representing clients in the space.
And I'm Carol Van Cleef. I am the chair of the blockchain and digital assets practice at the law firm of Bradley, Arendt, Bolt and Cummings, better known just as Bradley, and also the founder of Luminous Group, which is a firm that focuses on blockchain consulting, training, and ideation. I've been in and around the digital currency space for since the beginning, almost. I've been 2 feet totally in, beginning in 2008, and have been very much involved in the crypto space since 2012 timeframe, representing a number of clients with a number of different kinds of issues across the ecosphere.
Thank you, Karen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Han Verstrati. I'm the CEO and founder of Autonomous, and I'm not a lawyer, but we do provide incorporation services for the blockchain and the crypto community in the major jurisdictions around the world. And we also let companies be born on the Ethereum blockchain in Delaware, and from next week also in Wyoming. And so we have been very much on the business side, helping the community getting their legal entities set up around the world.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you making the time to join us today. I wanted to open the conversation with a bit of education to kind of set the table for our audience today. And I'm going to go in the opposite order. And I'm going to start with you. The first question is, what is a DAO?
You're asking me, Andrew?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Well, what we've seen from our users, right, is that a lot of blockchain projects, they are trying to decentralize their setup to allow the highest number of stakeholders to participate in their governance. And what we kind of observed is that typically they do that via the on-chain smart contract voting. However, we feel there is a second panel to this, which is their off-chain setup, which, as happens, paradoxically, is actually typically very centralized. So you have a mechanism on-chain that lets a wide group of people participate in voting, but off-chain you have a setup that is very much still controlled by the founder or the founder team. And so we have been helping clients to get both the on-chain and the off-chain right. And we feel that on the off-chain, you need to also make sure you have the mechanisms in place that consistently DAOify. You know, we call it DAO or die. If you want to hand on your heart, say we are decentralized, you need to be consistent and also do that in your off-chain setup. And so DAO would basically be a organization that combines the on-chain and the off-chain to achieve the widest possible degree of decentralization in how you make decisions and where your project is going. That's how I would summarize it.
And same question to Carol. Carol, we heard from Han kind of the blockchain side of things. Are there examples of decentralization that are entirely off-chain, that don't have any aspect of blockchain or cryptocurrency?
As I was saying, very good question. I was prepared for the last question to follow on and what a DAO is, but as I'm listening, I'm hearing almost every point that one needs to cover in that description covered. But I will say, from the lawyer's perspective, a decentralized autonomous organization. Let's just make it clear what the letters mean. I think they're an incredibly exciting aspect of the technology, essentially where the code can rule. At the same time, they're incredibly scary because the code can rule. And when you think about what we've been through in around the world in just the last 6 months or so, if you let code rule, what would have been the outcome versus where we've had to have some human intervention into that process. To take a step further into your question about, is our decentralized autonomous organization something that exists only within the blockchain arena? That's where I'm going to say I'm not a technologist, so I don't know how the technology sorts out. But I do know that the ideas around decentralized government are ideas that are being explored in a wide variety of ways now. And I think that this technology is one way, and maybe a very powerful way, for us to get there and be able to use these concepts.
Thank you, Carol. And Andrew, the next question I would love to throw to you, just to build on what Han and Carol provided. So based on that, what is decentralization? What is the audience here, just from the basic level?
Absolutely. So decentralization is basically the lack of a centralized entity that dictates and or controls the decision-making process that results in whatever the outcome that is based on the initial organization in of itself. So obviously we see a lot of different iterations of that in the blockchain context, and probably the most infamous one is coming from the DAO report, where Slockit company and the SEC seminal decision making in regards to categorizing a token as a security. And I won't get too far into that, but realistically, when you boil down what the DAO ultimately is it's a collective. And it's a collective of different minds that are all coming together to make a collective decision without any actual hierarchy that comes in and says, no, you can't make that decision. And so just to take the Slockit example, they were pooling funds to make a consensual decision on projects that they wanted to invest in. And so that's just, of course, one very specific iteration. And when you get into corporate governance and different types of applications, not only in the blockchain context, but also in the decentralized apps development context, you find that the organizations themselves really kind of lack that ultimate hierarchical third party. Now, of course, there are different iterations and the pendulum swings, but for all intents and purposes, that's kind of the gist of it.
Excellent. That is a perfect description. Jonathan, I'd love to throw to you, based on what we've heard already from the other panelists. Why might you decentralize? What are some of the key benefits that will come with making that decision?
I'm going to be the pessimist of the group. So decentralization scares the hell out of me. For the reason that, kind of mob rule scares the hell out of me, right? Especially with this COVID stuff, as Carol's mentioned, you kind of lose the fringes, and you don't have, possibilities of having a centralized person or entity. Like Andrew was talking about coming in and saying, hey, we need to slow this down, or we need to possibly stop this. So creating a DAO that is functioning at a high level and continues to function at a high level is going to require some really, really well thought out, not only programming, but also admission. Because you don't want everyone and anyone in your DAO, even though that is kind of counterintuitive to a DAO. And so it's going to be this really weird balancing test of, like I said, a technical component as well as a legal and ethical component of, should every person have one vote? Or if, I have 2 votes, what does that mean for the group? And so decentralization sounds really good, but we've got to figure out ways in which it works. And in most cases, unfortunately, it's probably not going to work very well because we are humans and we are, we are monkeys in suits. And as we, continue to progress through society, I don't know if that's going to get better for some time. We're going to try really hard, and decentralization can offer a lot of really swell benefits to the people who are in need, especially when you talk about, decentralized banking and things of money transmission and all those kind of fun things where we can really kind of take some of the lack of transparency as a hard edge against some of the banking regulations that are just unfair to those who have to pay 25% credit or 25% interest on their credit and things of that nature, where some startups are starting to look at someone's social media profiles and see if their credit worthiness. Now, if we as 5 had to vote on whether that person was credit worthiness, could we do it? Are we capable of doing it? So decentralization has a lot of really unique aspects, but I have yet to see one that I'm like, that's the thing that we should decentralize. That is the one thing that we need to push forward and make completely decentralized. And if someone can challenge me on that, I welcome it because I have not seen it yet.
Do we have any points in the panel?
Can I just add to that in terms of the benefits, Andrew, you were asking of DAOifying?
The other side.
So why are we DAOifying? And I think ultimately it's about winning the battle with the centralized institutions. So just from a commercial point of view, we have seen already in the past, before there was blockchain, that open source can be superior to closed source proprietary code. And we believe that by DAOifying your setup, you will ultimately create loyalty with a wide group of stakeholders. And that loyalty will ultimately lead you to win from the centralized players. Centralized players can only ever be as good as their employees. And they can only incrementally improve their product. Microsoft Word, Microsoft, what was it called? The Navigator? No, their browser, right? However, if you throw open, what was it called again? I'm obviously not using it.
Nobody could.
If you throw this open to a community to develop in an open source environment, even pre-blockchain, we have seen examples where the outcome is actually consistently superior to a centralized developed product. And so the key then is, how do you make sure you create that loyalty? It's not easy to get people to participate in your project and to continue to participate. And we've kind of seen that with Ethereum, which arguably still has the largest follower base and developer base because of that loyalty. And so DAO is critical in guaranteeing the highest possible degree of loyalty by giving people a voice. That's kind of the theme that we see is constantly coming back from our clients when they want to DAOify.
Oh, that's great. Andrew, can you think of any key benefits that we haven't covered?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, when we think about transparency and the decision-making process that has gone into some of the worst data breaches we've seen over the last 10 years, there's really good examples where centralized decision-making has actually had adverse consequences. Now, granted, I'm not necessarily saying that it's the end-all be-all solution, and we may not have seen an initial iteration of it yet that could solve that solution, but it does present a conceptual idea that could potentially lead to more transparency in centralized entities. Meaning that if those centralized entities start kind of ticking back towards decentralization, and again, the early days of this industry, it was kind of really one or the other. And that spectrum has expanded exponentially. And so now there's so many different iterations. And so the real benefits, from my perspective, fall on different planes on that spectrum. And so one being that transparency component, another one being allowing for the actual individuals who are represented by the organization to have full control over the decision making. And so, which kind of blends and ultimately is a subset of that transparency component. But at the end of the day, when you think about, okay, if collective decision making ultimately is checked by some third party or somebody in a higher position, then it's not going to be purely representative of the individuals who are making decisions. It's kind of like making the comparison between direct and representative democracy, which is a non-blockchain example, where you can have this decision-making process that ultimately does have an impact from individuals that might not necessarily have the same right as the base individuals who are making the initial decision.
And I would love to add something on that for a question for Carol. So Carol, based on that, knowing that co-ops, societies, associations, and public companies can all fall outside of blockchain and can absolutely be DAOs, what might be some of the key benefits to these types of structures using that as governance?
Well, I think that these structures are there's definitely an effort underway right now to look at the application of the technology to these structures. So that is definitely happening at the moment. I'm involved with a group that's working on trying to establish standards of governance around DAOs. And I will say that effort is very much in the early stages, but some very talented people who've been brought together to talk about the issues and start to sort through the issues around this to create a sort of a code of conduct for DAOs as we move forward. I think the use of them in these different types of organizations, again, is a very exciting deployment of the technology. I'd like to go a step further and say, what does that ultimately hold potentially for local, state, and national elections? And I think it's very interesting in the context of, will that help us? Will it give us more real-time decision-making? Is that where we're ultimately going to be going with this kind of technology? So I think that's one issue too, is that does it also get us around having to vote in person?
Which today might be a much-needed solution for next year. That could be where we're trending.
Anyone's read Twitter lately?
Well, to build on that, and I'm going to throw this one to Andrew. So Andrew, do you think that decentralized governance models will become mainstream for corporations and corporate governance?
Wholeheartedly, probably not. Mostly because I think that at the end of the day, the individuals who make up the centralized decision-making group are economically incentivized to maintain their power. So I guess let me kind of break that down for a second, because I'm not saying it's not possible. I just think that it's going to take a lot longer to get to that point than what a lot of people say in this industry is going to happen in such a short period of time. And so for me, especially when advising clients and talking about corporate governance and everything from deciding on what type of entity, what type of jurisdiction, everything along those lines, and what regulations are impacted by those two initial decisions, I think that in the corporate governance context, while there is a emphasis, or at least more of an emphasis today than there was 5 years ago, on transparency and on that decentralized component, I think that the general populace, one, needs to solve their educational hurdle in terms of understanding what this actually means before we get to full implementation. And again, I think that there's going to be a conflict between once the populace really does solve that educational hurdle and those individuals who are in those centralized roles that have an incentive to maintain their control. And also at the same time, like, there are very real world issues with decentralization in terms of inefficiency. Like if you talk about liquidity on secondary markets and you talk about decentralized exchanges, so like a DEX, I mean, there's not necessarily a guarantee to anybody listing whatever their asset is on that exchange that there's going to be that liquidity present. And so that ultimately ends up being more inefficient than, say, a centralized exchange where there's a decision by the actual entity to prop up that liquidity. And so that kind of functions as an example where there's some inefficiencies. And so those really need to be fleshed out before I anticipate a full kind of corporate governance implementation.
Now, Jonathan, what are some of those key differences between the centralized and decentralized governance with respect to co-ops and these examples we're talking about?
Well, so I mean, that's a great question, right? Like we need to bring a psychologist in this because a DAO at this level, right? You know, a little tribe level, let's call it, is fine. 5 people openly discussing, you know, what should be done. But when you start scaling that, as Andrew was kind of hinting at with corporations, things get wild, and they get wild fast. How do we verify that this is actually Carol and not some deep fake who's, you know, wants to talk to us about DAOs on this lovely afternoon? You know, we run into technology issues, we run into psychology issues, sociology issues, but I think that, you know, something like a small DAO, whether it's for a co-op or homeowners association or things like that, I think that's where, as Andrew was hinting, really it thrives. It thrives really well because you know that, you know, arguably all of the parties are trusted parties. I can go knock on your door. I can go, you know, chase you down in the hall if we have to have a longer discussion that maybe is not, you know, on chain. So when it does come time to vote, you know, we are able to participate. And, you know, that's part of the process when it comes to, and I'm sure Carol and those guys are looking at it. Am I voting, you know, autonomously? Am I voting with my name attached to my vote? Or is it something where, you know, your neighbor may throw you under the bus and say, you know, we want the noise hour to be lowered to 7 o'clock from 8 o'clock because you're, you know, jamming away in the garage too much. So there's a lot of really kind of fun things that can be done by the lawyers to put this stuff on a blockchain and then put, you know, with autonomous, to put the voting there. And so everything can be seen and everything can be recorded, and you know, corporate governance just becomes not something that we hopefully have to deal with more than once in this setup. And then once that happens, I think you're going to start seeing, hopefully, societies kind of behave a little bit better because we're able to actually participate and make a voting decision that matters and feel that our vote has been counted. Now, like I said, does that scale? It's above my pay grade.
But you do raise a fantastic point here around, you know, how do we know Carol is Carol in some of these scenarios? So, Hannah, I have a question for you. When we think about DAOs, autonomous does not always mean anonymous. What are some of these compliance considerations around identity for people that are participating in the DAO and getting them into the DAO and these types of things?
So thank you, Andrew. Our approach is that we should never be holier than the Pope. When I say that, what I mean is if the analog ledger allows you to be anonymous, then we can also be anonymous. On occasion, because of using the blockchain, we are a bit less anonymous. For instance, when you spin up a company with us on AutoCo on our blockchain product, you can actually see the wallet of the owner, the first member of the LLC. In the traditional ledger, you actually don't always see an identifier to the first member. Okay, that doesn't mean that you see somebody's name. You just see the wallet that they've used. However, in Delaware and even more so in Wyoming, a setup of an LLC can actually be made entirely private. And what we love about the United States, comparing this to other jurisdictions around the world, is that you actually don't have to do any upfront KYC when you establish a company. And we like that approach. And in many other places, Singapore, Hong Kong, UK, there is at least a requirement to, especially like in Singapore, for instance, where you need to do full KYC when you set up an entity. In the United States, they kind of push us further down the line. They say, look, you can actually legally incorporate a LLC, either analog or with our technology, as Mickey Mouse. Nothing prevents you from making Mickey Mouse the first member of an LLC. However, the trouble will come if further down the line you want to start doing real world stuff with your company and you need, for instance, an EIN because you want to open a bank account. And so KYC, interestingly, is actually not in the picture at all when you spin up an entity, a legal entity in the United States. And that has basically been a key component in why we were able to make it instant, because you push the KYC, know your client, further down the line.
But ultimately, the requirement would come. And Carol, being with your compliance background,
it will come because you obviously can't do anything in the real world pretending to be Mickey Mouse. And so you will at some point have to say, look, I'm, Andrew, and go full disclosure of who you are. But we do have clients who do not need an EIN, just use an LLC for one asset, for instance, an IP or even a smart contract. To the previous point of code is law, what we see is that people use this LLC, this instant LLC, as a legal wrapper to just get limited liability protection around smart contract code, because they release this code in the world, it's committed, and who knows what may happen. It may just backfire, it may do dumb things, it may not work out the way they expected it. So you just wrap it in an LLC. You can do that entirely anonymously.
May I jump in?
please.
And say that the laws, we've got 50 states, and we have not entirely 50 different state laws governing how you set up LLCs. So in some states, they have higher degrees, higher requirements that one has to meet in terms of identification. I think you've mentioned 2 jurisdictions where you're setting up entities that are on the lesser rather than more side of requirements for KYC. I'd also like to note that that's been an issue that's been very much debated in the US Congress for a number of years now. Almost every year there's a bill that's introduced to bring us up to standards that other countries are abiding by in terms of disclosure. So just a footnote that this world may continue as it is, but that may be a piece of the world that changes. But you're right in terms of after you get through that initial establishment of the corporation, if the entity wants a bank account, the entity is going to have to provide certain pieces of information to the financial institution. And it's going to have to, at that point, open the kimono, so to speak, to who the owners are, so the banks or other FIs can undertake the due diligence that they're required by law to undertake vis-a-vis onboarding any new customer.
Absolutely, Carol. Thanks.
Now, my next question from the audience is for Andrew. And Andrew, when we think about the different possible applications of where DAO makes sense, today in your experience, what is kind of that ideal use case for deciding to go this way with your governance?
For sure. So, and I think that this is more of a byproduct of blockchain technology being implemented in the fintech and e-commerce industry earlier on than the majority of industries. But this whole advent of decentralized finance, as well as this collective decision-making around ownership, distribution, resale of digital assets, as well as real-world assets, really kind of ticks at the top in terms of what not only I see with clients, but also kind of what I've seen just being in the industry for a good amount of time. And I think that those collective decision-making entities are somewhat now serving as kind of use cases for other areas. And we're seeing more of an uptick, like I kind of highlighted earlier on, in terms of the data privacy aspect in that industry. And with things like GDPR and California's law and other laws cropping up in terms of individual privacy information, I think, one, there's great opportunity for application there. I don't necessarily think it's gotten to the point where we're seeing it in decentralized finance. And if anyone's paid any attention to the news in this industry in the last 6 months, decentralized finance has exploded and is increasing in popularity exponentially. And as a result, I think that we're going to see some interesting consequences from that. And so right now, I would say that one of the most popular areas is really in asset ownership and asset distribution. And interestingly enough, especially kind of dating back to the late 2017 here in the States, with the categorization of certain tokens being securities and all the subsequent SEC decisions since then, we're now seeing opportunities. But again, it took a while and took clarity from a couple different regulators, not just the SEC, to get to the point where a DAO could potentially function to actually serve as record or decision making amongst shareholders who actually represent some type of digital asset that might represent their ownership in equity or debt, or maybe it's a real world asset like real estate. Those examples are cropping up now. And so we're kind of seeing this shift where the e-commerce application, which was at the top, is still remaining at the top, in my opinion, but those two other industries in terms of privacy information and asset ownership are creeping up as well. So there are going to be some interesting, and again, like going back to some of the topics and themes that we've discussed today, I think that there's going to be good iterations and there's going to be very bad iterations that could have negative consequences for the individuals that own those assets. And we'll most likely see litigation in the future, if not already seeing it now.
And I kind of looked to touch on both the good and the bad there. Like you mentioned that there might be some pending consequences for those particular groups in the future. John, in your experience and what you've seen in the market, who right now is facing consequences like this? Or do you think that, you know, the market has captured the benefits of this type of governance?
Oh, such a good question. There's just so much still to develop. I mean, if you know, I don't want to use the cliche that we're at the tip of the iceberg, but there's just so much. I mean, Cardano just launched mainnet yesterday. Like, no one in the regulatory framework of the SEC or the CFTC or FinCEN have any idea what, you know, possible implications that could really have, like, farther and farther down the line. And they're really good implications like Andrew was talking about, but there's also, you know, the possibility that someone may be in your pool and you don't know who that person is. And so that's terrifying. I love the technology. I absolutely love the technology. But like I said, we're still all human. And I think that until we can really kind of establish on-ramps that make sense, whether it's, you know, an identity solution that actually says this is who, you know, they say they are, or there's some type of KYC AML component from the government that, while regardless of your politics, you may or may not trust at different times, you know, you hope that the Secretary of State, and I've battled with a couple of them, will do the right thing, and that, you know, unfortunately can be a roadblock, or it can be a real facilitator. And we're all in this together is all I can say. I mean, you know, we're all lawyers except Han. You know, I joke that there's so much room left for us to develop this. I did a CLE on Monday where I preached for 3 hours begging people to come into this industry and figure out for, you know, the securities non-compliance element, but like figure out what wills look like on a blockchain. Figure out how we do trusts and estates. So where I send, you know, Andrew, I love you. So I send you my my entire net worth, but you lost your private key. So guess what? You don't get it. Like we don't have a solution to that. And most of the, God bless them, the lawyers who deal with those kind of things don't care about technology right now. That's not something that's an actual part of their practice. And so it's this weird world of trying to make everyone drink this Kool-Aid that you swear tastes good and that it's going to be everywhere. It's like the internet, like Han was saying, like it's all coming here. Like, trust us, guys. Like, open source is a thing. But we're all trying to work together in this weird amalgamation of a DAO ourselves, pushing towards a belief that, you know, this blockchain stuff has a lot of real world applications. And if we can develop them out together or in concert, we can really make a lot of solutions that hopefully for our grandkids, they're just going to laugh at and say, I can't believe you guys did that on paper. Like, what did that even look like? So
I agree.
I think there's a lot of still development, but we've got to do a lot of cheerleading. We've got to bring a lot of people who aren't in this space to come, listen to these types of webcasts, listen to me drone on in the CLE for 3 hours of how DAOs work and how blockchain works. Like, it's those kind of things that really make, somebody somewhere go, oh my gosh, I have the solution. This is perfect. Let me talk to Han and see if I can do this. Let me talk to Andrew to see if his background in law and technology can do this. Carol has banking down. Banking is an absolute mess. Once you become a bank or a trust, you can do whatever the hell you want to do for the most part.
I think if I can just add to that, I think the challenge for all of us on the call here is to build this. I think about it as a Stargate. So you go from the analog ledger into how things will look into the future and build them future-proof. The accusation I'd like to make to the blockchain community is that often they build, the Mars landers without figuring out how they're gonna get to Mars, and they're spending a lot of time on that Mars lander, and they tinker with it and an extra wheel and whatever, but they haven't figured out the rocket to get to Mars. And so I think what we're doing here at these crossroads of blockchain and law is that Stargate. I don't know if you guys saw that movie. It's actually a bad movie, but it's a powerful metaphor. You go from one world into the other, and it kind of transforms you. Now, Andrew, if you allow me, there's one aspect I'm sure you would have brought it up that we haven't talked about so far, and it connects to your question: why DAO-fi? Why a DAO? We do believe there's superiority of the open source approach, but there may also be a necessity when you offer a token to be able to show that you have a sufficient degree of decentralization for the Howey test. And I think that's a theme that keeps coming back with our users, where they say, hey, we're going to use this LLC now to do a token offering. We want to be able to say that actually the project is no longer in the hands of a defined group of people where everybody looks up to their effort, and as a result of that, they hope that they can get away with it not being a security token. Now, I am on very thin ground here, and I need to get the lawyers to opine on this, but it is an important component from the Howey test, I understand, and it is something that people bring up when they look to DAO-fi their setup.
Thank you, Han. Carol, I'd love to hear from you, from what you've seen in the market. What are the most interesting projects with decentralized governance today, and something outside of the blockchain world?
Oh, you like these loaded questions, don't you? I guess I find most interesting, I think, what we talked about earlier, which is taking it into the governance arena for potentially not for profits, but going beyond that, and even potentially into the corporate arena. Can we eventually use this technology to replace the decision-making processes that we have right now? And I think we're going to have to be very careful in selecting those kinds of processes that we undertake. I want to come back to a point that was made earlier, though, that, and this goes back in part to the SEC's decision, which it's hard to realize that was almost was more than 3 years ago now, in July of 2017, the DAO report. And since then, we've heard repeated regulatory commentators say that we don't really believe there's any DAO project out there right now that is truly decentralized. And I think that's something that is important for people who are conceiving of these projects, whether it's for Howey purposes or other purposes, to keep in mind that there's still a lot of fingers that can be pointed in a single direction around these projects. And so it's important for those who are conceiving and trying to implement them to consider the ramifications from a legal and regulatory perspective on them personally. As lawyers often say, that bad facts make bad law. And what I am always trying to avoid is having my client, present those bad facts that end up being bad, that end up in bad law that adversely affects them and what they're doing. So I just want to put a little bit to follow up on An's comments a few minutes ago. I think that's a point that's important to reemphasize here.
If I'm going to make a quick highlight. If you're dealing with a DAO and you don't, and this is for everyone, if you're dealing with a DAO and you don't have a lawyer, that's the reason that there's 3 of us on this thing. There's normally never 3 of us on anything until blockchain came along. The only reason lawyers have become so popular is because this stuff is so unknown and the consequences are dire. So if you're doing this and you don't have a lawyer, there's plenty to choose from. There needs to be more. Here's 3 of them. We continue to try to work together to figure all this stuff out. So please find one in your applicable jurisdiction as soon as possible before you make bad facts, because they're really tough to wind back and they do make bad law.
And John, I appreciate your comment about the CLE course that you were teaching earlier this week and encouraging the lawyers to get more involved. I think it should be underscored that when people are looking for counsel, though, they need to find counsel who really understands what's going on, because we have, unfortunately, too many, this is probably a very bad analogy right now, but too many bodies in the street because of bad lawyering.
That's an excellent point. Yes, it should be someone who is qualified in the law that you need. Don't have a divorce lawyer do this. It won't work out well.
So when we're thinking about mitigating these risks to ensure that a corporation, a co-op, or somebody is structuring their governance appropriately and compliantly, what are some of these additional considerations beyond counsel, perhaps around technology, compliance? And we can make this a broad example, let's say from somewhere in the US. If I was to create a DAO tomorrow, what should I be considering from my accountability perspective of having in place to ensure I don't fall off sides, to ensure that I've done this appropriately, and to ensure I can meet the reporting requirements? Andrew, I think I'll throw that one to you.
For sure. So I kind of want to start off the answer with saying that I think the SEC's proposal to have this decentralized factor component in terms of token offerings is probably one of the most progressive ideas they've had since they started paying attention to this industry. But realistically, for those who are taking on this consideration, one, I think that we can always look to the Ether Delta example, which was supposedly a decentralized exchange. And the individual, Zachary Coburn, he basically was hosting the order book of this exchange on a private server. And so he breached the decentralized component of the platform by having this centralized server. And so ultimately, and before I get into kind of the programmer's perspective and consideration, I think ultimately when you're creating that entity, one of the biggest considerations is, one, whether you're actually decentralized, and 2, what technological platform are you using to ensure that you are decentralized? Because if you're using a combination of centralized servers versus decentralized applications, then you could run into a potential issue, just like Zachary did. And so that's one consideration for sure. Another consideration is if you're the programmer and the developer of the actual application, going out and promoting it and telling people that it's going to increase in value. And this isn't even in the token context. This is just simply just in the platform context. And then it gets built upon by other programmers and then further developed by third parties. The liability component there is definitely something that, one, has been weighed on by a couple different regulatory bodies in the United States, but really comes down to this general notion that you're not completely absolved of culpability by any stretch of the imagination. And that's really something that I think sometimes is hard to process for those who are kind of purists in the industry that really think that some type of regulation or governmental influence should have really no say in the operation of their entity. And so ultimately, if you're trying to strive for decentralization, just make sure that even if you put forth all of your effort to that, there's still potentially going to be oversight from some governing body. And then the last consideration for sure, I think, which is also really important, is the great thing about DAOs is that when they're structured properly, they can potentially lead to that consensus decision making. But we have to take maybe a step back and think about how the rules are structured initially for that DAO. And so even if, and this is kind of an underlying theme in both my previous 2 points, even if the DAO itself is decided upon and then is left into the hands of the ultimate users, if you structure the rules to benefit the individuals who created the DAO initially, you are moving that pendulum away from full decentralization. And so, and there was a website, I don't know if it's still maintained, it was called Are We Decentralized Yet? And they listed all the projects in the industry that were decentralized, and they gave them a rating and so on and so forth. And I think that's kind of a really good indicator of making sure that you incorporate those considerations, but also with the understanding that just because you can convince yourself you're decentralized, it doesn't mean you're necessarily decentralized.
Excellent point.
And this is for the whole table. What do we think today is missing from what would make this more mainstream outside of our, wallet community or digital asset community, but more for, like your typical investment co-op of migrant workers living in a community looking to do money services back home, and these types of examples that we see in the different states, provinces, and countries around the world. If anyone wants to take that one, that's for the table.
For sure, yeah, I can take that one. So I think trust is really kind of the missing component. Because it comes with understanding, and it comes with understanding how these entities operate and how they actually function. And ultimately, a lot of individuals in the US and abroad trust institutions, and they trust Bank of America to make sure that their money is safe and soon to be their cryptocurrency. They trust other entities that operate. And now we've obviously seen an increase in distrust of certain platforms. But really, realistically, like how many users have gone off Facebook because of data breaches? Like they trust the platform, even though in the face of massive atrocities committed by the organization in regards to their personal privacy information. And so if we can get to a point where individuals can trust DAOs to the extent that they trust the centralized institutional entities, then that's really where we're going to see some progress.
I'd love to hear from Ann or John. Can you guys think of an example of a DAO in the market that has upset consumer trust, that did not do this appropriately, and is kind of a case study in how not to DAOify or run your governance? Hey, you're just muted there.
Andrew, I would probably like to refer to Dash. Dash is a very early project that is, I think, undeservedly not as big as it could be, but that's probably more to do with use cases. But the actual setup is pretty admirable. What they have actually done to decentralize is they've created a trust, and all of the token holders are beneficiaries of the trust. I believe the trust is set up in New Zealand for whatever reason, and it's not tax related. And the trust then owns 100% a OpCo, an operational company, which from memory is a C Corp in the United States. And so you have a very interesting mechanism of transmitting the wishes of the community, the token holders, the Dash token holders, to an operational entity, the directors of which are obviously appointed by the shareholder, and the shareholder in that C Corp is the trust. And in turn, the trustees are appointed by the token holders. So we very much learn from that in guiding clients into how DAOify their setup, because none of the token holders have to be a shareholder in an entity. They can just vote, pass the votes on, and the ultimate backstop is that they have the right to sack the trustee. But there is a fine balance between, and I think everybody on the call here will like that, from a legal perspective, you can't fully decentralize. You need to always rely on some element of delegation. We've seen that with direct democracy. It only works in Appenzell in Switzerland because the village has right? 300 people that raise their hand but that's kind of where it ends. And yes, technology can make that broader, but you still need to get that balance right between a community that you allow to vote, and at the same time people who just day-to-day execute. And I think they've got that right. Now, I'm not talking about the merit of the Dash coin and the Dash project as such. I'm just purely mentioning how they've set up their decentralized legal structure. A kind of an antithesis to that is Maker. So Maker, we know quite intimately. It is a very interesting project. It's obviously got a huge following. However, on the actual decentralization side, Maker is still very much centralized in the founder team with a foundation out of Curacao, where ultimately the one founder of the project calls the shot, is God. And so that is where we feel there's a disconnect between that on-chain and that off-chain that we mentioned earlier.
And for our general viewing audience, when Hannah and our colleagues here are talking about these tokens or these coins or currencies, these are at the end of the day assets. These are virtual assets. And although it could be represented by a token or a certificate, at the end of the day, this is your virtual stake in the governance and the structure in the corporation. So this applies beyond blockchain. And Carol, is that an accurate summary of kind of what we're touching on here as a group?
I'm not quite sure where you're going with that question, to be honest. We've done a lot of work in looking at different types of assets and in this arena, and what's the difference between a digital asset that's created, say, in the video gaming world, something that's been happening for many years. Does that what if you add an element of blockchain technology to that? Does that make it now a virtual asset, a token? And it's an interesting question, because if you start looking at the laws of different jurisdictions around the world, they're classified in different kinds of ways. And especially in the EU, there are several countries that will take an old-fashioned digital asset and now cast it as being a virtual asset that's subject to this whole regime of laws and regulations that were really intended to get at some of the issues we've been dealing with in the crypto space. And I think all of these things together start to add up with how do you look at them from a traditional compliance perspective, especially in the anti-money laundering area, where I do spend a lot of time, and to what extent I think using the Dash example as a governance situation is that do you have somebody in that structure ultimately with this decentralized governance who's going to be held responsible for what's happening with that coin and through that network? And if I were being appointed under those circumstances to a foundation, or a trust that was going to run a corporation, make the decisions, I would have to think very seriously about my potential personal liability in that kind of situation. And then how do you start to employ different kinds of tools to, help in the compliance in that arena?
Spot on, Carol. I don't think a lot of people would want to be a personal trustee. That's what you're saying. And you're right. And so we see people using private trust companies to get an extra layer of protection. But ultimately, there is nobody accountable, because the token holders are beneficiaries. It is the trustee who is ultimately having that fiduciary duty, without having, compared to a traditional setup, a settler of a trust who basically calls the shots. So nobody calls the shots anymore. It's kind of scary.
There's a psychology component behind all this. Like, it's above our pay grades, guys. Like, I really think that somebody should study this and see what level of autonomy people need and anonymity before things start getting wild, because as we can see on Twitter, you can hide behind a personality and spout all kinds of hateful things, and then be as kind and gentle in the real world as you claim to be, or righteous. So I think there's a lot of things that, like I said, are well above our pay grades. We can just do what we can as lawyers and see what kind of works out from a legal perspective and a compliance perspective. But I do think that, back to your point, Andrew, of if we had a simple solution for things like co-ops, things like HOAs, where they could, really kind of track their meetings, their minutes, voting, all those kind of fun things. And I know there's a couple products out there, but HOAs especially are super price sensitive, because as soon as you start spending money on anything, they want a whole full accounting. So I mean, it's those kind of simple solutions that I'm hoping come about, because people are recognizing real problems in the real world. Like Han was saying, don't build the Mars rover without the rocket. Build the rocket first, and then find out where you want to go.
I think that transitions us perfectly into where I kind of wanted to wrap up the conversation today, and that's the forward-looking, the kind of happy outlook. John, what do you see in the future for this? What are you looking forward to with DAOifying and the topic?
I mean, I think that it's going to be something like Andrew was saying. You're going to have to find really trusted third parties to onboard people, whether it's banks, whether it's identity solutions like iComply, so you can have a really trusted network. And then as that network grows, you can have Andrew, Carol, and I verify that this other person's an attorney because we all check the New York bar records or the Florida bar records or wherever. Those kind of solutions where the autonomous network starts growing in and of itself, without those kind of centralized parties, is where I think things are going to start progressing. And they're going to start progressing slow because they can't get big without stumbling upon themselves. And as Han was alluding to, if you don't have anyone at the helm, then nobody cares anymore, and things start falling by the wayside.
Andrew, same question for you. I'm just going to go clockwise in the wrap up.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited for all the local and state use cases to actually become use cases, because I think it'll slowly contribute to a standardization of how these actually operate. And I think of larger organizations that are taking the plunge, like UNICEF, to really see how this could potentially apply. And I'm just excited for those opportunities to give us the good outcomes and the bad outcomes, because we definitely need both. So it's going to be good.
I'm looking forward to potentially the day of real democratization, where everyone does have a vote. I guess the key is going to be, and the vote will count. I think the critical issue that we have to overcome, obviously, is going to be identification, and then obviously certain types of issues that come up, especially in a capitalistic or sort of survival of the fittest world, where there's always going to be somebody out there who's going to try to one up the next person in some way or another. But that would be my goal.
And then, Han, you get the last word on that question.
Well, I mean, everything we've been discussing today, in my view, kind of hinges still on going mainstream. So we can be concerned about ID, KYC, but it's not going to be relevant unless we can go from community to mainstream. And so we got to pass what I call the mom test. The mom test is that, when is my mom going to start using private keys? And so the main obstacle we see, you asked the question before, Andrew, is it's just not easy yet to use private keys. Because everything you do, whether it's voting in a DAO or managing your self-custodied assets, ultimately hinges on how safe and secure is it to access your private keys. And I don't see that immediately change. It's still very much a niche approach where people who are comfortable with wallets are doing stuff on blockchain, but mainstream is not doing stuff on blockchain. And so I think the big component of trust that Andrew was mentioning has a lot to do with the fact that people don't quite yet trust this technology. And that's our big challenge. Can we get to a point where you can easily spin up a company by scanning a QR code that gets your private key, and then your assets are held, your first membership shares are held in that wallet. I think it's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is that at some point an Apple or a phone manufacturer will come up with a compartmentalized very secure way of pulling up your private keys from your phone, stuff like that. But the whole community is still, I think, waiting for that private key solution, and it's not there yet. Until we have that, we'll just stay within a very confined group of people and enthusiasts who love to work with the technology. But my mom is not yet going to use wallets. I don't know about yours, Andrews. Yours is younger than mine, but ask her.
That was great, man. I appreciate that. Well, let's start with Carol here. Carol, why don't you take 30 seconds to just let people know where they can find you online that we're viewing today? I would love for everybody to just kind of get your plug in here before we wrap up.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's been great participating with everyone today. And I agree on the, whose mom's going to ultimately use this. I think user interface is a huge issue in all of this. But you can find me at cvancleef@bradley.com or at carol.vancleef at luminousgroup.io. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Andrew, where can people find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. You can just go to my firm's website. It's bullblockchainlaw.com.
Awesome. Jonathan?
Dunsmorelaw.com is the best way. Get in touch with me there.
Perfect. And Han?
So it's easy. It's Han at autonomous.com, OTONOMOS.com. And you'll find us on the website, and you find our Delaware and Wyoming project there as well.
Well, thank you, everybody, for your time, attention, and consideration today. It was a pleasure hosting you all on the call. I look forward to working with you again in the future, and you can reach me at andrew.w@icompliantis.com. With that,
thanks for having us, Andrew. Very good to see you.
You
grew a beard during COVID.
Quarantine.
Good to see you. Take care, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.